My name is Mike O Sullivan. I'm an economist with the World Bank's Gender Innovation Lab. I'll be presenting joint work with colleagues also from the World Bank Gender Innovation Lab, as well as researchers from LSE, Northwestern, and Georgetown. And so to sort of motivate the work for you, a common feature of countries and developing economies is sort of the absence or missing markets in terms of credit, insurance, and land. And of course, theory suggests that trying to tackle these missing or imperfect markets in tandem might yield higher returns. So to take example, though, from land rights and sort of property rights more broadly, theory would predict, of course, this collateral channel of using land titles to acquire credit. But in practice, in the empirics, we see that that's really not the case across sub-Saharan Africa. So we're looking at ways to sort of boost the impact of rural land titling interventions by addressing liquidity constraints with households. So we'll be doing this in a setting in southwest Uganda where sort of documented land rights are rather low, very low actually, and even access to formal credit, particularly among rural smallholders, is low. So in the sample that I'm talking about 8% of households had acquired a formal loan in the previous 12 months. And so we're working with Uganda's Lands Ministry as well as with BRAC Microfinance Uganda to sort of address both the tenure security constraints that households face and liquidity constraints. And so the research questions that we're going to be focusing on, the first one is more sort of for those interventions that are rolling out these land formalization interventions, is whether sort of addressing these credit constraints in tandem can actually deepen or enhance the impact of land formalization and land titling interventions. But we also want to see sort of whether simultaneously addressing these constraints can sort of lead households to double down on their on-farm investments and sort of enhance that, or does it sort of cause them to diversify away from agriculture and exit agriculture? And given the sort of distributional implications of this and the fact that women tend to have lower ex-ante property rights and control over key assets, we want to test how these effects may differ by gender. And so the sample design, the study design, is sort of a two-stage randomization where we have our sample of 378 villages that are randomly allocated into one of two buckets to receive land titles or to not. And then actually within all of these villages, we then randomize at the household level whether households receive credit. So that leads us to arms where you have land and credit, just land titles, just credit, and then a counter sort of a comparison group against which we can base our estimates. And so to give you a sense of the interventions, what we're talking about, the first stage intervention, which is nearly complete, is actually similar in the sense to what Andy and others have been doing. It's sort of the rural analog to the work in Tanzania to try to induce households into joint titling. So we provided fully subsidized land titles to households and then experimentally varied whether they receive conditions to jointly title, information about the gender benefits of joint titling, or both. And then we have a group that's sort of what you could view as the gender blind intervention. The intervention that we're currently designing, and for which we welcome your feedback, is a credit product that will sort of be suited more to the needs of rural smallholder households. We intend to randomly assign the recipient of the credit offer to be kind of consistent with the titling intervention design, cross-randomizing that. And some of the features that are under discussion, and again, for which we welcome your feedback, include flexible repayment schedules that align more with the sort of lumpy income flows of rural households, subsidizing interest rates to sort of attract more households at the margin and deal with the low take-up challenges that you often see with these kinds of studies. And then I think a key feature that's been mentioned by others, and Greg Lane's in the room, and others who've done work on risk contingent credit, trying to pair sort of features of a credit, for example, a credit line that's tied to some agricultural risk. And that's something that I think is appealing to us and something that we're going to be considering going forward. And so in terms of the data collection and timeline, we actually have two rounds of pre-intervention data, one baseline in 2015, when we were expecting the scale up to really happen, and then in 2017 when the work really got underway. Land titling intervention itself and the kind of detailed land administrative data collection that we also are sort of carrying out is wrapping up. We anticipate working with our partners at BRAC and with the ministry to prototype, do some more qualitative field work, and then roll out some pilots in our sort of outside of our sample regions to test these credit products. And then in the sort of mid-2019 period, we're going to conduct another household survey. And then following that, we'll be immediately rolling out the credit intervention to try to get households at that key period of time when they're making their investment and crop choice decisions for the following period. We're going to be collecting data in 2020, as well as another round of data collection over here. And so when thinking about linkages, this is actually part of a bigger research program that we're carrying out on property rights and land formalization interventions more broadly across sub-Saharan Africa. We're going to be looking at, in terms of the outcome space, of course, the on-farm sort of types of outcomes that you would expect, but we'll also be looking at those kind of off-farm outcomes, namely, non-farm income-generating activities, as well as migration decisions. And given the kind of emphasis on strengthening women's land rights and providing liquidity to female smallholders, we're also going to be looking at within-household effects in terms of decision-making, bargaining power, et cetera. And then we'll also be looking at resilience to shocks and reliance on social networks going forward. So with the time that I have remaining, I'll quickly talk about some early results from our first stage experiment. A few takeaways to keep here. Overall take-up for the land titling credit offer was rather high in our first visit, about 92%. This first bar basically you can view as the sort of gender-neutral or gender-blind intervention. Surprisingly, take-up of joint titles, this is the blue part of the bar, was rather high, about 62% of households. And this is actually consistent with data that you see from LSMS and other data sources in Uganda, that women actually have high de facto land control and access in parts of Uganda. Now that, of course, has implications for our power to detect across these treatment arms. Then looking at provision of gender information, basically this up to here gives you about a 25% increase in the level of jointness without dampening overall demand for titles. So this shows basically that just telling households information about the benefits of having both spouses on the title, for example, in the case of the deceased, if a spouse were to be deceased, what would be the benefits, actually gets you a 25% increase. Going from sort of the nudge to the shove and sort of imposing this hard condition gets you to essentially the same level of take-up, but these are all joint titles, so it's a 50% increase. And so across these treatment arms, in our second household visit, we do see that essentially take-up drops down to about 72%, not as high as the 92%. Most of that was due to sort of ineligibility, family land issues, et cetera. But we'll be looking, of course, at those households that dropped out and comparing them going forward. So in terms of challenges and the next steps for this work, title processing and delivery actually has posed a challenge for us. The maze and thicket of bureaucratic procedures, even working closely with the ministry, having the sort of full force of the World Bank projects behind us, I think has been it's been a learning experience for all of us, and we're now sort of well versed in all of the Byzantine processes and procedures to obtain a land title, and should give you a sense of how difficult it is to obtain. We're wrapping up this field work in sort of the next couple of months. But the other challenge relates to the credit product design. The take-up levels, as you all know, for these types of products tends to be rather low. But there is this trade-off between kind of the external validity constraint, external validity, and the need to sort of boost the take-up. And then we also wanted to sort of a product that does take into account the kind of other types of risks that these households face, such as weather risk. So in terms of next steps, I've kind of gone through, I've already discussed kind of what our plans are going forward, but I do want to mention that we're sort of linked. This is a great time for us to be doing this work because the World Bank's project in the next phase is planning to scale up land title delivery to hundreds of thousands of households. So we're hoping to kind of influence the design of that. And as well, BRAC itself, BRAC Microfinance Uganda, which has almost 200 branches, 200,000 plus members, MFI clients, is aiming to roll out an agricultural loan product in Uganda. So they want to take the learning from this activity and use it to sort of design their product that will be sort of scaled up nationwide. So with that, I will leave it to you for questions. Thanks very much.
I'm curious about the cost effectiveness of this kind of program, because I suppose some people are curious about the cost effectiveness of these kind of sometimes more cost effective. I suppose some way there's about formal registration systems. Sometimes, yeah, I hope that there's something going about formal registration systems. Yeah, I hope that.
Yes, absolutely. So we're looking at sort of the costs of. I mean, in some sense, this is an expensive door-to-door, delivery of titles, for example. But when it comes to the added marginal costs of, say, the video, I mean, I didn't mention this. I mean, we have a paper coming out that it details all of the take-up findings from the first stage land titling experiment. This information, which was given in the form of a video, was rather cheap to prepare, and then the marginal cost was almost negligible. And posing the condition equally in terms of costs, it's just a few more seconds of explanation in the household interview. But we will be doing some cost-benefit analyses for that, and then of course thinking about the credit product in a similar way when we roll it out.
Yeah, I was wondering, do you have a sense from your baseline data whether these farmers are saying like they actually feel different from investment based on the fact that they're on titles, or is it like salient for them?
It's a great question. So,
Can you repeat the question?
sort of, to what extent do farmers view this document as salient or determinant in making investment decisions and choices? That's kind of what you were getting at, yes? So, in doing qualitative field work prior to the start of this study, we, tried to elicit from farmers their information, their baseline knowledge even of titles. So there is some misinformation and some sort of degree of, there are some households for which they just don't have a clear sense of what a title brings them. But for those who do, it very much is something that's sought after and something that is almost unattainable given the time, the transaction costs, and complexity of getting one. Yes, in sort of talking with farmers and doing these kind of focus group discussions, you do get the sense that they very much would value that, and it's something that they would very much, like to have. Of course, the revealed preference side, we want to see whether this leads to changes in behavior going forward. But yes?
I'm just going to sound very slow here, but could you just back up a little and tell me about the land titling? Is this land that was owned together by both the spouses, or is this inheritance land? What kind of land was it?
Yes. The benefits of 10 minutes, you can't cover all of the details, but so essentially when we sampled households, we wanted to find only households for which we had married spouses, it could be customary or not, and who had at least one parcel of land that was eligible to be titled. So if you had, let's say, family land, which is very common in parts of Uganda, in this part of Uganda there's a lot more privately held land, that would not be necessarily eligible for the freehold title document. For households that had more than one eligible parcel, we randomly selected which one received the title. If it was purchased in a market transaction, that would be eligible. There were certain criteria, but a lot of these were basically viewed by the community as being owned by this person, and there were no contested claims from other claimants before providing the title, and it followed all of the kind of procedures. It was the ministry itself that was carrying out this work with us in tandem.
Sorry, just in the interest of replication, and because I find it quite exciting, because it seems like you actually created an incentive for co-titling, right? Or for joint titling. But that will only work in cases where there is a right to marital property. Not so much in countries where there isn't a right, like my own, where there isn't a right to marital property. Do you look quite different over there?
Yeah, no, this is a good point. So we're trying so our hope is to possibly test this also in Cote d'Ivoire, which has a different marital regime, and see to sort of what extent these kinds of approaches will work in other settings. But it's a great point in the sense that, drawing inferences for other contexts, you're limited to what you can say about it. Yes.
I wonder if there's a sense in which like the ease of microcredit access is actually shut down one of the reasons why farmers in these kinds of situations would normally have wanted titles to the extent that that was motivated by simplified access to microcredit. Do you get a sense in talking to the direct folks that terms or amount of credit that they would not necessarily for experiment, but in general be willing to offer are meaningfully different depending on whether a person has a title responsive to the presence of a title or not?
So BRAC says that they would take that into account if they were to, so if you have a freehold title and you want to pledge that against as a form of collateral, they will actually take that into consideration when determining the risk profile and the likelihood of lending. But that said, you know, sort of anecdotally and speaking with others, there are a lot of concerns about judiciary and enforcement of you know, that, and of course there's the risk rationing of households who decide, look, it's not, I'm not going to bet the farm on this just because, you know, who knows what's going to happen in this agricultural season. I might lose out, and then I lose my plot. It's not worth it. So we did initially talk about actually sort of focusing only on the titled sample and see whether kind of offering these collateralized loans is something that we should explore. At this stage, because we wanted a broader sample, we didn't go down that route. But BRAC has actually talked with us about an interest in coming up with some kind of mortgage product or something that allows households to deal with the credit constraints of purchasing a title. And that's something we're actually in conversations with them right now about.
But in the current design, the credit is not conditional on the title. So the title value is not so much the inability of the land, it's the certification, it's the fact that there will be no land conflict. The boundaries are well established.
Right, so we're not currently tying the credit to, we're not even making mention of the title in our interactions with the households. So to the extent that, you know, you're not drawing on the collateralizability itself of the product. And we're actually even talking with BRAC right now, and we're open for feedback about this. This is why it's a great point to get this feedback about sort of offering, we can sort of with BRAC deal with the lending risk of, you know, basically providing these secured loans, because these are going to be, they're not going to be pledging collateral from the household side.
So in which case you don't need titling, you need certification, which is a much cheaper way of guaranteeing access.
So it's a testable question, absolutely. I think, so in the north of Uganda, where you have much more communal land arrangements, land certification and certificate of customary occupancy is more common. In the south, initially when we were coming up with a design, we wanted to test certification with the sort of Cadillac version of a freehold title. We weren't able to do that. Government was very keen on freehold titles, so that's where we ended up. But that's something we would love to be able to tease out.
I think we have to break.
Okay, great. Thank you.